Wise men say only fools. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about inequality. And I want to start by getting us to think about the importance of Amit. I want us to think a little bit about the importance of looking at life in an objective way. So, the first challenge is that we look at life through some colored glasses, sometimes rosy, sometimes not, and it's a little bit hard to understand what's really truthful and what we're processing and seeing what we hope to see. So let me give you some examples for this. This was a blind test for beer. They asked people to taste multiple beers, and they said, please rate those beers on intensity and bitterness. And that's basically what you got, different beers. This was a while ago. Different beers occupied very different space in this. So that was great. And then this was non-blind, which means that people got the can, they got to see it, they got to rate it, and so on. Now, to another group, they asked to rate the same beers, but in a blind way. What does that mean? People did not have any clue about what beer it was. They only tasted it and rated it based on taste. Here is what happened. All the beers were the same, aside from one. Which one? Guinness, of course. Okay, now, if you think about it, it basically said, okay, Guinness is special, but the rest of them are basically the same if you think about the taste, and the only difference comes from the can. Now, is the difference real? Yes, it's real, but is it coming from taste? No, it's coming from the can. So it's an example where you expect something to be different because, for example, you paid for it more, it had a more prestigious brand, and you're experiencing it in a different way. In a very different example, we did a study some time ago in which we gave people some pain medications. This was actually a placebo, so it wasn't a real pain medication, but we gave people these pain medications. And we told some people they were expensive, some people we told them were cheap, some people we told they were made in the US, some we were told they were made in China. And then we connected them to a machine that gave them electrical shocks, and we tried to see how much pain could these people suffer, and whether the type of medication they got would alleviate some pain. And what did we find? We find that when the pain medication was said to be more expensive, people had higher expectations, and therefore it helped them more. When we told them the pain medication was very cheap, they didn't expect much to happen, and much less happened. By the way, when we told them it was made in China, we thought it would be basically like cheap. But it turns out that Chinese medication has a special place in people's understanding of medication. So the Chinese medication was basically the same as the American. Thank you. For people from Chinese origin, it was actually slightly elevated. But whatever the results are, it basically tells you that, again, we view the world in kind of, our physiology experiencing the world in a way that we expect it to happen. Final example of this, you can think about basketball, but there was a very famous football game between Harvard and Yale many years ago. And after that game, they went to people in the audience and they said, please describe to us the game. And you read the description of the people on the Yale side and the Harvard side, and it's as if they haven't been in the same place. And you can imagine the same thing happens in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you name it. It doesn't have to be sports. The reality is that we want to experience the world in a certain way, we're motivated, and therefore we have these filters that influence our view of the world. So if you think about that as a starting point, now I want to talk a little bit about inequality, and we're going to talk about the problem of taking off these glasses in order to observe inequality in a more realistic and accurate way. So let's ask a couple of questions about inequality. Let's ask about what we know about inequality, and then what we want about inequality. So let's start with what do we know. So imagine we took all the people in Israel and we divided them into 5 buckets. we took the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the next, and the richest 20%. Actually, it's the other way around. The bottom 20%, the next, and the richest 20%. Okay, so we have these 5 buckets. And now I want you to figure out how much wealth, we have 100% wealth across the country, how much percent wealth is concentrated in each of those buckets. Now, the data I have is from the US. It's not from Israel, but the Israeli data is not very far. But let's talk about the American data. So how much wealth do you think is concentrated in the bottom 40% of Americans? Just to get us to think about this, we have 100% wealth, the bottom 40%. If society was perfectly equal, they would have 40%, right, if it was socialism. So how much wealth do you think they have? Just raise your hand and shout. Okay, let's try, shouting is good, let's try another approach. How many people think it's between 5 and 10? How many people think it's more than 10? Very few. How many people think it's between 5 and 3? Okay, how many people think it's below 2? How many people think it's below 1? Okay. When we ask people this question, people think that the bottom 20% have 2.9, the next 20% have 6.4, so together it's 9.3, right? So you were, on average, you thought it was less than the Americans. You maybe thought on average it was 4 or 5. They think the next group has 12, 20, and then 58. So this is what people think, right? A lot to the bottom, very little to the poor. Now, what do we really have, right? What's reality? And again, this is reality in the US, but Israel is not too far. The bottom 20% has 0.1. The next 20% has 0.2, double than the lower one. Together it's 0.3. By the way, this is very close to 0. Right? Now this is not income, right? People do make money, but they can't save. They have no wealth, right? So if something bad happens, life just deteriorates. Then it's 3.9, 11.3, and the top have about 85%. So we have inequality, but we don't understand the level of inequality. And you too don't understand, based on what you voted, don't understand the level of inequality we really have. You think it's bad, but it's much worse. And you probably more or less understand that the top have a lot, but how little the bottom have, people just don't understand. Okay, so we think of this as the knowledge gap. This is what we think, this is what we have, this is just we don't know. But now, let's talk a little bit about what do we want? Now, what does it mean to ask the question of what do we want? There's lots of ways to think about what we want. Economists often think about it in terms of the efficiency of society. How many people should we have unemployed in order to move society forward? There's lots of ways to think about it. We decided to follow John Rawls. John Rawls was a very famous philosopher, and he had, in his theory of justice, he said something very interesting. He said, a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you would be willing to enter it in a random place. Now think about what a beautiful idea this is, right? If you're very rich, you want the rich to have money and the poor not to have money. If you're very poor, you want equality. If you don't know where you'll be, and you could be randomly assigned to each position, you have to consider all perspective, right? And he called it the veil of ignorance. Why? Because you choose which society you want to join before you know where you'll be. It's a little bit like blind tasting, right? Because you don't know which perspective you will have when you're doing it. Okay, so we asked a group of people what they want. And this is what people said. They wanted the bottom 20% to have 10.5%, 14%, 21, 22, and about 32. Now, nobody in our sample, and we tested about 30,000 people, nobody in our sample wanted perfect socialism, right? Nobody wanted equality, people understand that have something about inequality, provides drive and all kinds of other benefits. The question is, how much do you want it? But what you can see is what people want is drastically different than what we think, and of course even more drastically different than what we have, and particularly focused on the fact that all of a sudden the poor have something. So we call this the desirability gap. Now, you can ask questions about, are different people different in that, right? So we have what people think is a just society. Is the definition of just society different for different types of people? So we try that. We try to see whether liberal and conservatives are different, and they are different, but in a tiny way. For example, in one question, we showed people a distribution of wealth in Sweden, actually slightly more equal than Sweden, and we showed people a distribution of wealth in the US. We didn't tell them this was based on Sweden. And we asked them, which one would you like to live in under the veil of ignorance? 92% of Americans chose the Swedish version. For Democrats, it was 93. For Republicans, it was 91. So different, but very, very small differences. The same thing happens for rich and poor. Different, but very small different. Men and women. People who read Forbes magazine, basically more to the right. People who listen to National Public Radio, more to the left. We tried it in different countries. We tried Australia, England. We did also one study in Israel with all of them showing basically identical results. We also tried different departments at the university. Here we found one interesting difference. People who went to the Harvard Business School wanted the poor to have less money. But even that was a small effect. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine that we plotted the pay ratio of CEOs to unskilled workers in their companies. And what you have here is different countries and the ratio, 20, 30, 40, 50. It's perfectly on this line, so it's a little hard to see. Here is what people think it is. Okay. And then what happens when we ask people what the ideal is? You see the little blue thing in the middle? So what people think is the ideal is much, much smaller than what people think it really is. Okay, and then there's a question of what's the actual. And the actual you see in red. And you know what, when you look at this, you say, that's not too bad, right? But the reason it doesn't look too bad is because I plotted it on different scales. So reality is this. So what you have is the pay ratio in red. Again, what people think it is vastly different from reality, and what people want is, again, vastly less than this. We also thought about other outcomes of wealth. You know, we can ask about wealth, but we can ask about other things, right? We can ask about things like how many babies should die at birth? I know it's a terrible question, but how many babies should die at birth to the poorest 20, the next 20, the next 20, the next? It's the same question as wealth, by the way. The correlation is basically perfect between that and wealth. But when you ask the question about what mortality of baby are we willing to accept, people are not willing to accept almost any inequality. So when people think about money, they say, oh, I'm willing to accept some inequality. When they think about babies dying, not so much. When we ask them about prescription medication, not so much. When we ask them about life expectancy, I told you about. The same thing about education. When you ask people about consequences of money in terms of education, all of a sudden people want even more equality than what shows in money. So here's the thing. We have this, first of all, we have a learning gap. We have something that people just don't understand, and all of us don't understand the crazy amount of inequality we have. But then the question is, under what conditions would be willing to do something? Under what conditions would we be willing to take some actions? So in another study, we tried to put people in the position of policymakers. So imagine you're a policymaker, and you see two people, and one of them gets $25, and the other one gets $3. And you, as the policymaker, can decide to tax them. So you can take some money from the rich and move it to the poor. How much money would you move? Okay? And now you can think about how did these people get the money? For example, what if the person who got the $25 had the choice between taking $3 for sure or risking it and having 80% chance of getting 0 and 20% chance of making 25? What if the reason they have so much money is because they took a risk? Now all of a sudden the policymaker still is transferring some wealth, but not as much, because we want to reward people for taking risk. But what if the person, the other person, the person who got 25 maybe got the money because of risk, but the guy who got 3 had no choice in the matter? What if they had no agency? They had no ability to change their outcome? What happens now? Now the policymaker is happier to move more money in. So what that means is that when we want to think about how to try to resolve some inequality, the easiest place to attract, to go to, is places where we think it's not people's faults. So in the US, when we have adults, people say it's your fault. You decide to be poor, right? You have an agency in it. But when we talk about kids, all of a sudden people don't see agency and are willing to accept many more social programs, suggesting that it's the right approach to try and solve things by education at early age as a starting point. Let me say one thing that is more general than that. Oops. If you think about these lessons, I think there's a question more generally of how do we look at our political life, but also at our life in general in a more objective way. So think about the roles definition, and now think to yourself about all kinds of political problems in Israel. And ask yourself to imagine, because we can't do it for real, imagine that you were in the veil of ignorance. There was a certain probability that you will be born in different places in society, that you will be assigned to different types of parents, coming from different neighborhoods. What would your outlook on society be like under those conditions? And you know, it's really tricky, because if you think about it, every time we experience something, we experience based on our expectations, right? But the fact is, we have to try and fight it. We have to try and fight it, see things a bit more objectively, and then maybe we will also realize that we're much more equal. Because the good news about all of these results is that when you look at American politics, you can't imagine that people on the right and on the left agree on anything. But the fact is that when you abstract the question and you ask them about what do we believe a just society is, the similarity is just striking across the board. And I don't know how the same thing would work in Israel in some of our real challenges that we have, more than just right and left wing. But can we abstract it? Can we look at things more objectively and maybe see that we have more agreement? So this was a rather depressing talk, and now we'll move to something a bit happier. Very good. Toda.